She was too tall to hang easy, so they made the rope tighter. The image burned into Elias Creed's mind before he even stepped down from his saddle. It was the spring of 1878 out on the edge of Arizona territory, where the wind whispered through broken fence posts, and law meant the man with the loudest gun. The sun was dying behind a red ridge, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. Elias had spent everything he had for a patch of land and a second chance. But what greeted him wasn't peace. It was a girl hanging beneath a splintered gallows, her legs kicking weakly against the air, and a silence so cruel it screamed. That day he didn't inherit a ranch. He stepped into a story soaked in rope and blood. And you, where are you watching from? A warm room, a quiet evening? Let me know in the comments. I think you'll want to stay for this one. Elias Creed had seen men die in war, fast and loud, with powder smoke thick in the air, and no time for last words. But this was different. The rope had been pulled too tight. Whoever tied it didn't want death to come quick. They wanted her to feel it, the choking, the panic, the slow squeeze of life slipping away, while the prairie watched in silence. She was still alive, just barely. That much he could tell. Her tall, muscular frame trembled as if defying the noose fighting, even as the last of her strength faded into the dust. The wind shifted, dragging the scent of rust and old wood through the yard. Elias dismounted his boots, crunching into the red soil. He didn't move fast. There was no one else around, but the weight of decision slowed him because he knew what this was. This wasn't a robbery or justice or some wild town prank. This was a warning, hung like a signpost, a body offered to the wind with no burial planned. And the ranch, his newly bought fresh start, stood behind her like a lie dressed in timber and dust. He reached for his knife. His hands, though strong, shook. The blade cut through the rope, and she dropped like a sack of wheat. He caught her. Her skin burned with fever, her breath ragged, and the marks on her neck were deep, far too deep for mercy. She whispered a name before she slipped under again. Cain. Sold me. Elias's jaw tightened. Samuel Cain, the man who sold him this land, with a hurried handshake and a smile too easy, who rushed the paperwork, whispered about a legacy of opportunity, and pushed a bottle of cheap whiskey across the table like it might dull suspicion. Now Elias knew why the price was so low. Cain hadn't just sold him a ranch. He'd sold him a crime scene. A girl hanging from a post like livestock, and a graveyard of unspoken horrors buried in prairie silence. Inside the house it was all rot and echoes. But he cleared a place on the floor and laid her down, covering her with his coat. She looked so young in the lamplight, despite her towering size. A child's face worn thin by betrayal, the kind of hurt that gets whispered about in saloons long after the music stops. Elias poured water between her cracked lips, and for a moment, just a flicker, her hand reached out and clutched his. That was all he needed. Because whatever Cain had left behind, whatever deal had been pour my sacrums with men who believed power came with rope and fire, Elias Creed had just undone it. And in doing so, he'd tied himself to something bigger than deeds or fences. This wasn't about land anymore. It was about dignity. About choosing whether to walk away or stand for something, even when the cost came stamped in blood. Stick around, because the rope was only the beginning. What came next would test every scar Elias carried and awaken something in a girl the world tried to hang and forget. She shouldn't have made it through the night. Her breath had turned shallow, skin clammy and pale. Elias sat beside her, watching the fire die down to coals, the silence broken only by her ragged inhales. Each one sounded like it might be her last. He'd tended wounds before on fields where friends bled out faster than prayers could catch them. But this was a different kind of wound. The kind that doesn't bleed on the outside. The kind left by betrayal and by a world that names you beast long before it ever calls you girl. She woke just before dawn. Her eyes opened slow, like they were still deciding whether to trust the light. And when they met those pale, storm-touched eyes, Elias didn't see a monster. He saw someone crawling her way back to life with nothing but spite and instinct. She flinched when he moved. "Easy," he said, voice low and even. "You're safe now." Safe. Even as he said it, Elias knew it wasn't true. Safety didn't exist out here, not for men like him, and certainly not for girls who got left hanging like scarecrows at a gate. She tried to speak, lips cracked and voice raw. "Water." He lifted the cup, slowly held it to her lips. She drank like she hadn't tasted mercy in years. Then she whispered it again. "Cain sold me." Elias nodded once. No need to press. She'd tell the rest when she was ready. But then after a long silence, her voice returned barely more than a breath. "They called me monster. Said my strength was unnatural. That a girl that size wasn't meant to exist. Said I was built for work, not for life." She turned her face toward the wall. "My mother named me Mara," she said quietly. "But they never used it. Not once." Mara. The name hung in the air like a candle in a dark room. Elias let it sit there unspoken for a moment, as if afraid the wind might snuff it out. "I'm using it now," he said. "Mara, that's who you are." She didn't answer, just stared into the fire like it was the only thing left that hadn't betrayed her. He didn't ask more questions. He just sat there warming the room with his silence. Sometimes kindness doesn't come in words. It comes in not asking. Later, he helped her stand. Her legs shook under her weight, her hand gripping his shoulder hard enough to bruise. But she stood, and that was something. He fetched a shirt from his saddlebag, rough wool, and too big even for him. It fit her well enough. Covered the bruises. Gave her back a little dignity. She didn't say thank you. Didn't need to. The way she pulled the collar closed spoke more than words could. Outside, the prairie was waking up. Crows circled the empty gallows, and the wind carried the scent of something coming. Elias looked at her one more time. "You got a name now," he said. "And tomorrow we make sure they never take it from you again." Because the first step back from the edge isn't healing, it's being called by your name. A man doesn't just cut a rope. He cuts his own past with it. Elias Creed didn't sleep that night. He sat at the edge of the bedroll, fingers wrapped around the handle of the same knife that had sliced Mara down. The fire had gone to embers. Shadows curled like old regrets around the cabin walls. And in those shadows, his mind drifted back years, maybe decades, to another time, another rope. There'd been a boy once, a good one, wild hair, wild heart, hanged by raiders just outside of Abilene for stealing food. Elias had ridden past that tree, seen the boy swaying too late to save him. But what haunted Elias wasn't the death. It was how fast he'd kept riding. The war had made him cold, efficient, and for too long he'd worn that coldness like armor. But when he cut Mara down, something broke. Or maybe something opened. Because cutting that rope wasn't just about saving her. It was about not riding past again. Now in the still of the early morning, Mara stirred in her sleep. Her breath was calmer. Her fingers no longer clenched into fists. Elias watched her for a moment. How her chest rose and fell. how her giant frame looked both powerful and painfully fragile. She'd survived cruelty that would have shattered most men. And yet she still held on. The old hymn might have called it fate that brought him here. But now Elias wasn't sure it wasn't something more like penance. He reached for a piece of wood by the hearth, an old cedar scrap, and pulled out his pocket knife. Slowly, he began carving. Not for any purpose, just to keep his hands steady. But as the shape began to take form, he realized what it was. A rope, frayed at one end, sliced clean through. He turned it in his hand and sighed. This cabin, this land, this broken girl with eyes like stormlight, it was all too much like the past he'd tried to bury. But maybe Elias thought the past doesn't stay buried because it isn't supposed to. Maybe it comes back when it's time to be rewritten. He set the carving down near the mantel. A simple thing, a reminder. Then he stepped out into the dawn. The prairie was cold and vast. The noose still swung gently from the beam. Elias walked to it. His fingers closed around the rope and yanked it down hard. It snapped from the hook, coiling at his feet like a dead snake. He tossed it into the fire pit without ceremony. Mara had come to the door, leaning heavily on the frame. Her voice rasped like gravel. "You could have walked away." Elias turned to her, his eyes quiet but clear. "I did once, a long time ago. And I never forgave myself." Mara didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. They stood like that, just two souls scarred and worn, watching the last of the noose burn away in the pit. Some ropes are cut with steel, others with choice, and the hardest ones with memory. If this chapter of the story speaks to something deep in you, maybe a mistake you carry or a silence you've kept, I'd be honored if you'd share this video or tap that like button. And if you've ever been where Elias once stood, walking away when you should have stayed, tell me, what would you do differently now? Debts are written in ink. Others are carved into skin. The fire pit still smoldered when Mara spoke again. Her voice cracked like a dry twig, but didn't waver. "You said you bought this land from Samuel Cain." Elias nodded, jaw tightening at the name. Mara stepped forward barefoot on frost-bitten ground. Her gait was uneven, each step stiff with pain, but her posture had changed. Taller. Not just in height, but in weight. Like someone who was done hiding the burden. "He didn't just sell you land," she said, eyes dark and unflinching. "He sold me." Elias said nothing, but the silence between them grew thick, choked with the kind of fury that men like Cain relied on never being spoken. "I worked this land," Mara continued, voice low. "Cleared the weeds, hauled fence posts, pulled the plow when his mule went lame, built up this place with blood and bone. Then one day he said the collectors were coming, that I was too big, too strange, not worth feeding." Her hands trembled, curling into fists. "So he handed me over, like livestock." Elias looked out over the land, the soil he thought he'd purchased, the fence lines, the barn, the sagging roof, every piece of it built on someone else's suffering. And Cain, he'd vanished with the money, leaving Elias holding both the deed and the consequences. "I should have known," Elias muttered. "He rushed the deal, told me to sign fast, said the land was clean." Mara gave a hollow laugh. "Cain never did anything clean." A breeze rustled through the field. A lone crow landed on the fence post where the noose had hung, cawing once before flying off. Those men, Mara added, voice quieter now, the ones who came here that first night. Cain owed them money. He promised them this land. And me. Called me a monster. Told them stringing me up would scare anyone from getting close. Elias felt his hand clench around the grip of his belt knife. Cain hadn't just run from his debt. He'd turned a human life into currency. He looked back at Mara. "You said they'd come again." She nodded. "They said I was their payment. They don't care who owns this land now, only that Cain promised it. And once they hear you're not handing it over, they'll bring more." Elias let out a slow breath. War had taught him many things, but this was something worse than battle. This was betrayal in layers, Cain selling dirt soaked in a woman's blood, strangers trying to claim her like property, and a town that looked the other way. He stepped closer to Mara. "He sold a lie, and I bought it. But I'm not selling it forward." For the first time, Mara's eyes softened. Not with trust, not yet, but with something close. Recognition. Maybe even relief. When a man sells land, he should be sure it's only dirt he's letting go of, not the soul of the one who built it. Strength can split a man's skull, but it's the first tear that truly cracks a soul. The cabin had fallen into silence again. Only the wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the dry scent of dust cedar and something older sorrow long buried. Mara sat at the edge of the bed, her massive frame hunched beneath the weight of something far heavier than muscle or bone. She stared into the fire as if it owed her an answer. Elias had set a tin mug of warm water beside her, but she hadn't touched it. Her hands were balled into fists on her knees, knuckles white against weathered skin. Elias sat across from her, watching without speaking. He knew enough not to push. But then Mara moved. Slowly she reached toward the fire, and with a trembling hand touched the edge of her own sleeve. "This," she said, her voice low, "was my mother's. Just a strip left from her old apron. I sewed it into my shirt when I was 10. Her hand paused. "She called me her little maple. Said even though I grew too tall, too fast, I had roots, a purpose." She fell quiet, the firelight flickering in her pale eyes. "She died when I was 11. Fever took her. And from then on, the world only saw the height, not the girl." Elias stayed still, letting her speak. "They used to throw rocks at me in town," she said, eyes never leaving the flames. "Cain was the only one who didn't flinch when I walked near. He offered work, a bed, a name on the payroll." Her jaw tensed. But it wasn't kindness. It was investment. And when the debt came due, he cashed me in like any other asset. There was no bitterness in her voice, only exhaustion. Elias saw it now, this towering figure who could break fence posts with a single swing, now folded inward like a child trying to disappear. Then the tears came. They didn't fall all at once. They welled slowly, clinging to the corners of her eyes like they'd been trapped there for years. One drop slipped down her bruised cheek and landed on her sleeve. She didn't wipe it away. "I fought everyone," she whispered, "until I couldn't anymore. And when they hung me, I thought, at least it's quiet now." Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Why are you telling me this now?" She looked up, eyes red, jaw trembling. "Because you cut me down." Silence settled again, but it wasn't the kind that suffocated. It felt different, like a door had opened, even if just a crack. Elias nodded. "You were never a monster, Mara. You were just left alone too long." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You're the first person who's ever said my name without fear." He let that sit. No more words. Just the fire, the shadows, and a crackling kind of trust that felt both fragile and unbreakable. Sometimes the strongest walls aren't made of wood or stone. They're built from silence, and they crumble only when someone finally listens. If this moment moved something in you, even just a little, drop a 1 in the comments. If it didn't, that's all right too. Go ahead and drop a 0. Either way, thank you for being here. Because out here in the West, even the quietest truths still echo when someone dares to speak them. Stick around, because come dawn that passed. Mara tried to leave hanging on a rope. It's riding back with a gun in hand. Out here, fences don't just keep danger out, they keep promises in. By the time the morning sun crested over the hills, the frost had already begun to melt. Mist clung low to the prairie grass, and the world smelled of damp earth and burnt wood. Elias Creed stood by the broken fence post, sleeves rolled up hammer in hand, sweat already rising on his brow despite the chill. Mara stood beside him, clutching a beam of cedar thick as a man's chest. Her fingers, still swollen from rope burns, closed tight around the wood like it was something sacred. Together in silence they worked, driving stakes deep into the ground, resetting boards that had been left to rot by Cain's neglect. Each thud of hammer against nail wasn't just labor, it was rhythm, a ritual, a sound that meant we're staying. Around them the land stirred to life. Birds nested in the eaves of the barn again. A pair of wild rabbits darted through the dry brush near the well, and the battered ranch house, though still weathered by time, looked a little less like a place of abandonment and a little more like something waiting to be claimed. Mara broke the silence first. "Why do fences even matter?" she asked, ears narrowed on the post she was driving in. "They never stopped men from coming in. Didn't stop what Cain did." Elias drove one more nail, then wiped his brow. "Because they're not for keeping them out. They're for keeping us in. Focused, rooted, honest." Mara blinked. Honest, Elias nodded. "A fence says this land matters, that someone gave enough of a damn to draw a line around it and say, here, this part of the world is ours to protect." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once as if a piece of her had clicked into place. "Then we need rules," she said. "Not like Cain's. Real ones." Elias leaned on the post, amused. "Rules, yeah," she said, standing tall. "If this land's ours, it needs to mean something." He didn't argue. He just listened. Mara held up a finger. "Rule 1, no lies. Not to each other. Not to the people who come here looking for help." Elias nodded slowly. "Fair. Rule 2, strength isn't about who can pull the hardest. It's about who can carry more than just weight." He smiled at that one. "I'll carve it in wood." "Rule 3, she said, looking toward the rising sun. "No one gets left behind. Ever again." That one lingered in the air, like smoke after gunfire. Elias pressed his hand against the fence post. "Then we better build this thing strong." And so they did. By dusk, the first stretch of fence stood tall, no longer a barrier, but a boundary. Not to shut the world out, but to tell it. Here something good lives now. In the West, it isn't just about what you build, it's about the code you live by. If you've ever had to rebuild after someone left behind a mess, after the trust was gone and the damage already done, then you know what it means to set new rules post by post. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and maybe, just maybe, what your own fence rules would be. The West has a way of testing your peace the moment you start to believe in it. It was the third morning since the fence had been rebuilt. The sky burned with a soft orange haze, the kind that warned of dry wind and restless riders. Mara was checking the gate, her movements now confident, eyes sharper than they had ever been. She no longer flinched at every sound, no longer curled in corners trying to disappear. She had claimed space now, and it had begun to claim her back. Then the dust came. First just a low whisper over the ridge, then hooves, then shouting. Elias stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, when he saw them 5 men rifles, slung carelessly, riding like the land owed them something. The same ones who strung Mara up. The same gang who'd come calling a week earlier with debts in one hand and fire in the other. But this time they weren't laughing. The man in front, a wiry snake of a rider with a scar along his chin, spurred his horse forward. "You're still here," he spat, voice gravel and venom. "Thought we made ourselves clear." Elias didn't answer. He just shifted his stance slightly, placing himself between Mara and the fence. But Mara stepped forward, not behind Elias, beside him. Her voice was calm, steady. "You've got one warning. Turn around and ride." One of the riders laughed. "You hear that, boys?" The freaks found her tongue. Another leaned in, eyeing her massive frame with a sneer. "Cain always said she was more beast than woman. Maybe we ought to put a collar on her, see if she still bites." Something in Mara's shoulders tensed, but didn't break. Not this time. Elias could feel it too. The rage was there, but so was the choice. And it wasn't violence she reached for. "It was the truth. She's not a beast," Elias said quietly. "But you sure sound like pack animals who've lost your scent and don't know it yet." The scarred rider snarled. 3 days, that's all you get. We'll be back. And this land, her whatever claim you think you've got, it all burns. They turned, dust rising behind them like a curtain. And just like that, the prairie was quiet again. Mara didn't move right away. She stood still, breathing deep. Then she spoke not to Elias, but to the wind. "They're wrong," she said. "I'm not a monster. Not anymore." Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, not to guide her, but to show he was right there. "You never were. Out here it's easy to be shaped by what you survive, but harder still to decide who you'll become after. Have you ever been called something so many times that you started to believe it? Have you ever looked it in the eye and said, 'Not anymore'? Tell us below if you've ever had to prove you're more than the names they gave you. This part of the story is for you. Some promises aren't spoken. They're written in calloused hands, in ledgers soaked with sweat, and in petals offered when no one else ever gave you a name worth keeping." The night after the riders left, Elias sat at the table under the dim glow of the oil lamp. The ledger lay open before him, Samuel Cain's legacy of lies and numbers stacked like gravestones. Debts to suppliers, loans with impossible interest, and Mara's name scrawled at the bottom, not as a worker, but as collateral. She stood by the doorway watching. Quiet. Not fearful, but waiting. Elias didn't speak right away. His fingers traced the dried ink, the uneven handwriting of a man who never planned to stay and fight. He closed the book gently, then stood. "You're not a number," he said softly, "and you're not property. Whatever Cain wrote here, it ends now." Mara blinked, then frowned. "But the debt's still real, isn't it?" Elias gave a small nod. "It is. But how we repay it, that's ours to decide." He walked to a shelf, rummaging in a drawer, and returned with a tiny wooden box. When he opened it, inside lay a carved wooden flower, delicate, carefully whittled, its edges smooth from age and memory. "My mother made this," he said. "Said no man should ever forget beauty, even in the worst times." Mara stared at it like it was a thing from a world she'd never been allowed into. "I kept it through the war," Elias continued, "through blood and fire, and I thought, maybe one day I'd give it to someone who reminded me why I still carried it." He placed it in her hand. Her fingers shook, not because the carving was fragile, but because she wasn't. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. Elias met her eyes. "You survived a hanging. You stood your ground when they came back. You helped rebuild a ranch Cain tried to bury in shame. Tell me if not you who does." Her lip quivered. Not from fear this time, but from something harder: acceptance. Outside, the wind blew through the tall grass. Inside, two outcasts stood in silence, a flower between them, and the echo of a promise not yet spoken. Sometimes the hardest thing to do isn't fighting for your life, it's standing in front of those who once looked away and daring them to see you. It was market day in the small town of Dry Hollow. Elias had hitched the wagon before sunrise. The sacks of corn they'd harvested over the last week were tied down in the back, fresh, full, and clean. The ledger in his pocket showed they were finally making good on the first third of the debt. But the paper wasn't the real weight he carried. It was Mara seated quietly in the back of the wagon, knees pulled close, shoulders hunched, as if she could somehow fold her towering frame into something smaller. She hadn't wanted to come, hadn't wanted to be seen. But Elias had said one thing that stuck: they strung you up when you were silent. Maybe it's time they hear your voice just by seeing you standing. The road into town was quiet, but when the wagon turned past the church and into the town square, it wasn't. People stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. A bucket clanged to the ground, all eyes fixed on her. Mara stared back, her jaw clenched. For a moment, the air felt thinner, like the day she'd hung in that yard gasping. Except this time she was standing tall. This time she could breathe. Elias stepped down first, nodding to the baker, then to old Mrs. Keller, who stood by the well. Some nodded back stiffly. Some didn't. Mara climbed down behind him, her boots thudding heavy on the dirt road. She towered over nearly every man present. But the bruises on her neck were faded now. The shadows under her eyes had retreated. Her hair was braided, clean, and in her shirt pocket, tucked carefully beside her heart, was the carved wooden flower. At the grain booth, the old trader Elias had bargained with months ago leaned forward, squinting. She, the one they... He didn't finish the sentence. "She's the one that survived," Elias replied calmly, his voice low even. The trader's lips pressed into a line. Then he nodded once, slow, deliberate. "Well, surviving out here means something." A woman from the sewing shop approached hesitantly. A girl in tow clutched her hand. "You're Mara?" the woman asked. Her voice was quiet, almost ashamed. Mara blinked. "Yes. My daughter heard them call you a monster." The woman continued, glancing down. She wanted to see for herself. There was no apology in her voice, but there was something else. Uncertainty, maybe, or regret. Mara knelt, bringing herself eye level with the little girl. "You see a monster?" she asked gently. The child shook her head, eyes wide. "I see a giant with flowers in her shirt." Mara smiled. For the first time in town, she smiled. That was when it happened. Something shifted in the crowd. A breath, maybe. A crack in the wall they'd all built around their own guilt. Because the woman before them wasn't the beast Cain had painted her as. She was real, and she was human. Old Mrs. Keller stepped forward next. She placed a small pouch of seeds in Mara's hand. "For your garden," she said, then added softly, "I was wrong not to speak up when Cain sold you off. I see that now." Elias watched quietly from beside the wagon. He didn't interrupt. This moment belonged to Mara. One by one, others came forward. A spare spool of thread, a sack of potatoes, a mended saddle. No one said the word sorry directly, but they didn't have to. Sometimes the apology is in the offering. Later that day, when the wagon rolled out of town, it was heavier with goods than when it arrived. But what weighed most was something invisible acknowledgement. Elias glanced at Mara beside him. Her hands held the pouch of seeds like they were made of gold. Her expression was quiet, thoughtful. "They looked at me today," she said softly, "and not one of them saw a rope." Elias smiled. "No, they saw someone who lived through it." She nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Maybe next time they'll see someone worth planting roots beside. Some ropes were made to kill, but others, if cut in time, can bind two souls who never thought they'd belong to anyone again." The gallows still stood at the edge of Elias's land, but it no longer cast a shadow of death. Instead, it was covered in wildflowers. Vines climbed the old beam, and at its base stood a small sign Elias carved himself: "New roots grow from old knots." Mara had insisted they keep it, not to remember the pain, but to honor what came after. It had been months since Elias found her hanging there, barely breathing, since the land nearly swallowed them both in Cain's debts and the wrath of his enemies. But now life was here. The ranch had been rebuilt. The corn grew tall. And the town, well, the town had started to look at Mara with different eyes. Not all, but enough. Children waved when she rode by. A widow dropped off fresh bread. Even the blacksmith offered her a hat made for her size, said it was about time the biggest heart in town had one. That night, Elias and Mara sat on the porch. No words between them, just the sound of wind through the stalks and the faint creak of the flower-covered gallows. She broke the silence. "You know, sometimes I wonder if I really was a monster," she said, her voice low. Elias looked at her. "No. You were just waiting for someone to look long enough to see past the bruises." Mara smiled softly. "You didn't just cut the rope. You gave me a name again." He shook his head. "You always had one. I just listened." And with that, the silence returned, only this time it felt like home. Inside the cabin, on a shelf above the fireplace, sat a small wooden box Mara had carved. Inside it, a piece of the rope, a worn shirt button, and the deed to the land with both their names on it. Not owner and worker, not savior and saved, but two people who chose each other. No vows, no blood, just scars healed in the same light. Some stories begin with a rope meant for death, but the best ones end with a rope that holds a home together. Now let me ask you, have you ever had someone believe in you when the world had already given up? Or maybe you were the one who reached out, who helped someone rise when they couldn't do it alone. Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this one meant something to you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe. Because out here in the West, and in life sometimes, all it takes is one brave hand to cut the rope.